This meeting is being recorded.
Okay. Well, thank you all. Again, just want to thank you all for joining us here today. I am going to just let everybody know, please, while we're listening in on the good conversations and the presentations today, if you will just raise your hand or put something in the chat if you have any questions. We will be considerate of others as we have this good conversation. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to hand this off to Adrian, if you want to go ahead and get us started.
Amazing. Thanks so much, Thomas, and thanks everyone for joining. Before we get started, I'd like to just briefly draw your attention to this disclaimer, which is standard StratFi practice, just warning that this presentation is provided as is and shouldn't really be relied on for anything. It contains no investment recommendations of any kind. The agenda for today is going to kick off without the launch music, unfortunately. What the plan is to go through a quick intro and recap of the proposal that Hasu has posted onto the forums. I hope you've had a chance to familiarize yourself with it. If you haven't, while I'm giving the TED talk, might be a good chance to do that as well. And then the idea was to open the floor over to the participants and make all of the time available to live Q&A with Hasu, who is joining on the call as well. So what I'll do now is I'll walk through the key elements of the proposal very briefly, and then we'll open the floor to any questions after that.
Hey, Adrian, hey, interrupt. Rune also just mentioned in the chat that it's a short presentation. So Rune, I'll make you co-host if after this presentation we want to go from there, okay?
Say that again, sorry, I didn't follow. Rune would like to present something.
Yeah, in the chat, he says, I have made a short presentation to explain the main differences and similarities between the council design and the Endgame centralized workforce design. So just wanted to give you a heads up on that. Okay.
Fair enough, that's helpful. We also have slides prepared on a similar theme afterwards during the Q&A, so it might be relevant to touch on those points also then. So briefly, what we're doing here is, so Maker is at the bottom of a generational opportunity where we have a huge opportunity to capitalize on the on-chain crypto asset market, where we've established a clear lead and are a decentralized stablecoin of reference. But there are further opportunities ahead, namely and largely oriented around serving retail more broadly, reaching them across the multi-chain domain, serving them with CDPs and liquid DAI availability, and more importantly, integrate natively with new protocols from the ground floor. But on the other side, we also face a much greater opportunity of pairing Maker's key competitive advantages with the enormous opportunity of on-chain real-world assets, where Maker has an opportunity to be the senior wholesale lender to originators of reliable tokenized credit, if done correctly. However, at the foot of this mountain, what Rune and Hasu and others have identified is that there are two problems. The first one is probably the more fundamental one, that Maker has an identity crisis. And from this identity crisis stems an associated governance crisis. So there are constant fundamental debates raging all the time about the orientation and the direction that Maker should go on. And as a result, the governance process tends to get logjammed or very fiery or have superheated fundamental debates constantly. Well, what Hasu's proposal is doing is trying to break down the governance supply chain into its key constituent elements, starting with vision, going through strategy, tactics, and implementation. In this structure, Maker currently looks something like this, where token holders and delegates have all of the power, they run all of the executive spells, but are fundamentally overburdened with having to take care of the vision, the strategy, and the tactics, leaving the mandated actors and the core units in charge of the implementation. A first step in this proposal would be to enact and enshrine some of the key values of Maker in a constitution that would be slow to change and would require a very large majority to approve. The next step would be to introduce the concept of a council of makers. Although if the community has a better idea for a name, it's the less important detail. But in this way, through specialization and focusing on each link of the governance supply chain, the MakerDAO can retain all of its decentralized features while still empowering the protocol towards working towards its vision and its objectives. The division of labor essentially unlocks efficiency, but at the same time, it also increases decentralization when approached through a governance supply chain framework, where we separate the decisions and introduce greater accountability on the workforce. So in summary, create a constitution for Maker and establish a council of makers. What this produces is a minimally viable DAO that essentially does very little. So it barely manages the treasury, it manages the budget, and it appoints, recalls, or watches the mandated actors, but nothing else. And in this game theoretic equilibrium, you're able to capture essentially the bare minimum that you need to safely govern the Maker protocol. For the first point around writing a constitution, on this page, we're showing one example, but it would essentially need to be a bottoms-up, a sort of bottom-up community-driven process. What we're hoping is that we'll also start from the Vault users and the DAI users, who very often get left by the wayside. And fundamentally, Maker, the protocol, the product, should be maximally oriented towards serving their needs in order to find success. The advantage of writing a constitution through this framework first, and keeping it very strictly narrowed on the vision and the principles and leaving the strategy aside, is that all the other decisions flow from this key constitutional document or element that essentially encodes in writing what's very difficult to write in smart contract code. On this page, we're giving an overview of how the Council of Makers would interplay in the overall governance supply chain and the overall Maker decision-making ecosystem. So here, the way that we're thinking about the protocol is essentially a minimal protocol oriented around the executive spell, where the abstraction and the separation of powers should make it possible for the token holders and the delegates to be the only ones essentially taking any decisions. And for all of the processes, and essentially orient governance around processes instead of orienting governance around people. By doing this, you can drive towards a goal where the executive spell can eventually be automated maximally and keep it very, very minimal. And for everything else that can't be automated, or that can't be abstracted, where you do still require a workforce, you design it in such a way that you maintain all of the key features that make being a part of that workforce attractive. You maintain and you increase the decentralization, but you also increase the accountability of this workforce to the token holders. And again, the token holders and the delegates keep their hands on the wheel. They elect the Council of Makers, they can recall the Council of Makers. The buck ultimately stops at the token holder and on the delegates. In conclusion, this is how we're framing the solution to this problem statement, finding a rock-solid agreement on values and goals, and introducing independent accountability and minimal governance. So I think that's basically the end of the presentation. By the original plan, I think the idea was to switch to a Q&A. I don't know now, I'm not looking at the chat, I don't know now how, Thomas, you want to handle this? Perhaps Rune would like to step forward and explain some of the key differences between this and the Endgame plan. But I'd appreciate if the
No,
community were
actually,
able
Adrian, I'd love to not. I'd love to hear from other people. No offense, but I think what was exciting to me about this meeting was to hear other views in the community. I was just putting in the chat a note. So maybe, I don't know if Rune doesn't mind letting
could I
others
propose that? So
have.
could I propose that if there is a question around the Endgame plan or how this compares to the Endgame plan, then that might be an appropriate moment for Rune to step in. And until then, if there are any other questions, I think it'd be nice to let the writer of the proposal handle the Q&A. Cool. So I'm going to stop sharing now. And yeah, I think I see some hands raising, and I think it'd be nice to get some of their points of view.
Yeah, we've got two hands raised. I think the Governor's House had their hands raised first. If you'll go ahead, please.
Yeah, thank you. so just like a general comment on this, like I like where it's heading, like with, you know, delegated kind of power to people who will be full-time focusing on assessing the you know, the progress and making the right decision on behalf of community. I think as we are growing larger, this is super important to have someone who, you know, can be informed kind of and also specialize in the topic. My question here is, you said like there will be still kind of the possibility of removing votes from the constituents. Is there some like time period where they will be kind of leave to prove themselves? Means like as we have now, you know, elections to, let's say, government, like we have 4 years, that's probably too long, but there is like 4 years, you do what you promised to do. If you haven't achieved it, next election you will probably not be voted in. Is something like that will be happening as well? Or can it happen that basically because of one thing or one bad comment, they will be just immediately removed and get out of that? Don't mean like breach anything, but mean like just people don't feel like to having it there.
Yeah, okay. Hi, Punka. I assume you're talking about the council, is that right?
Yeah, that's correct.
Mm. Yeah, so I think what you're saying, so first of all, I think what's really important whenever you put specialists in place to do a certain job, or you basically, you delegate any task to anyone else, is first of all, what you want to do is you want to specify what the deliverables are, you know, of the job that the specialist is going to take over. And for either for the council at large, as well as for different members of the council, they might have different deliverables that optimally would be measurable, for example, right? I mean, so for example, grow DAI supply by a certain amount, or onboard this amount of new collateral types or assets while maintaining a certain you know, balance sheet structure that sort of is given from, for example, from the constitution. But what you want to do is you want to define deliverables, and then you want to hold the council accountable to these deliverables. And one way that you can do this, that's sort of automatic, is you define one portion of their pay as unconditional. For example, if they survive their 1 year served, then, you know, they get this money for sure, but another part of their salary can be tied to these OKRs, to these deliverables, right? And so only if they reach them, then they also get that part of. So they have a big incentive to actually deliver what they promise. But in any case of like especially sort of egregious misbehavior or underperformance, you still want to give MKR holders the chance to fire a council member or even the entire council at any time. Just, I think you also pointed at this, it cannot be used as sort of a denial of service attack, right? So you probably want to have a certain quorum of MKR holders that is necessary in order to fire the council. I hope that answers your questions.
Yeah, that answers my question. When I was heading to, like, I just would feel that like this kind of position should be long-term position and people should focus on long-term goals rather than like be worried if next Friday they will get enough votes to still be on the you know, on the board. So that, yeah, that's
Yes.
answer my question. Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, I completely agree. My gut feeling says that you want to make the position for 1 year at least. And then, I mean, you still have the ability to fire someone, but give them like 1 year chance, because this, I mean, you need some amount of time to execute any kind of longer term strategies, in my opinion.
That's great. I think I saw in the chat, I don't know if anyone else has their hand raised. I know I saw in the chat, Brian had a comment around MakerDAO's white paper as the existing constitution. And I was wondering if Hasu, you could comment briefly on this. Yeah,
it's been a while since I read the white paper. I haven't seen it come up in any votes or in the forum, or really. I mean, I remember reading it mostly as a technical specification, and sort of loosely outlining how governance is going to work. I will definitely take another look, and I think if you think that the white paper would be a good constitution, then by all means, I think we should bring it up more in every vote and hold delegates and co-unit members and MAs accountable to executing exactly what is in that white paper. However, we should also give a path to updating this, right? So if we use it as a measure of accountability in order to ossify parts of the Maker protocol base that cannot be put in smart contract code, I think that's mainly what we want to do with governance, right? We want to sort of, or by having a constitution, is we want to put into writing and ossify that way whatever we cannot ossify by making it immutable in the protocol itself. And so, yeah, I think it basically that's the idea.
And I think in the one thing the white paper does is quite minimalistic, and it has quite a sort of purist appeal. And I think that's actually quite appealing. And one approach of this sort of simple plan is to try to go back to that original separation of sort of the proposal calling for the workforce and then the executive voting for the things that are or could be eventually algorithmic, right? Like the parameters and all of maybe the more quantitative things. So from this point of view, I think it aligns reasonably well, but like Hasu, I think I would also have to study again since it's been a few years.
Can I ask a question? So when the original sort of governance structure was created, there was a lot of thought that went into sort of adversarial actors, like what would happen if MKR holders were launching some sort of governance attack, and then there was this sort of depth of mechanisms in place that would stop that attack from executing. I feel like as we layer other types of sort of governance, whether they end up being from the Endgame plan or some constitution or some other thing we haven't yet imagined, a hybrid or something totally different. How much thought is going into like really assuming that your governance actors are like malicious and bad actors here? Like, because I think that's the ultimate sort of end result of where we're headed. In fact, I would even assume that your governance actors are state level actors. Yeah, so has anybody like kind of thought about like what it looks like for a state level actor to attempt to attack this constitution? Or
yeah, I mean, great question. I mean, I completely agree. There's this quote. I mean, I assume many are aware of it from Warren Buffett, who says he only invests in companies that any idiot can run, because one day an idiot is going to run it. And I mean, so this maps very well to adversarial thinking in public blockchains and sort of DeFi protocols at large, right? And I wouldn't be proposing this if I didn't think that this would make our governance structure not just a bit more robust, but way more robust to adversaries and to any kinds of attacks that can happen to it. And I want to go back to really to sort of first principles. So what the proposal does is it has two components. So first is this idea of the governance supply chain, which is the hierarchy of decisions that need to be made that exist in any organization, really, whether it's formalized or not. And then the second part is mapping the governance structure to that governance supply chain. And that governance structure says who makes these decisions, right? And what it allows for specialization and division of labor. So for example, you can have one party do the vision and one party do the strategy and one part do the tactics, right? And this allows them to divide the labor and specialize in these different areas. But even more importantly, what it does, it allows you to discuss these things separately, and it gives every role a clear scope and makes it more accountable to the rest of the organization, right? Because right now, if somebody makes a bad voting decision, what do you really attribute this to? Like the lack of vision, the lack of strategy, or a bad tactical decision, or something else entirely, right? And here we can always like very clearly say what even is the fault that happened, and at what layer did it happen. And so I think, yeah, I'm really convinced that this introduces more accountability into the system.
There's I don't know if Peyton, you're raising your hand. I don't know if you want to ask a question. There are a few questions in the chat. I'm taking notes.
Yeah, I had a question, but happy to go from the chat as well.
No, go for it. Go for it since you're on.
Yeah, I was wondering, maybe Hasu, if you could describe like what the ideal candidate for a council person might be. Like what type of things would or should they be good at in order to excel at this role?
Great question, Peyton. I think from a very, two qualities that I think we want in a council member is they should be taking a bird's eye view of the Maker protocol, but also the DeFi space, the crypto space, and the credit space at large. And you want them to have a really long-term perspective on these things. And I think it also helps if they are the sort of good capital allocators. I mean, because a lot of what the strategy role is going to do is just allocate capital from the treasury and manage it in a way that makes it independent of bull and bear market and of sort of downturns that can happen in particular assets, right? So strengthens Maker's balance sheet, but also set it up to grow. And yeah, so these kind of things. And then within the council, I think you want to have both specialization. So you want council members that represent specific areas of expertise, for example, around collateral or reward assets, or around treasury management, or around technology. But you also want a couple totally independent parties or wildcards, right? So I think, for example, that DAI holders should get a seat on the council, and our largest borrowers should get a seat at the council, right? Because I think ultimately what blockchains and DeFi protocols are really about is separating control from ownership of these assets, right? So, and I think this is, in my opinion, this is the future of DeFi, where sort of you basically it's not don't be evil, but can't be evil. So.
Thank you.
There was a question in the chat about where the first principles were coming from, probably oriented maybe around the governance supply chain or similar. I think Vamsi maybe asked this. If I can get the question. No, or yeah. So what are the first principles to that point? They have not been articulated, question mark.
Sorry, what is the question?
The question is literally, what are the first principles to that point? They have not been articulated. I presume it makes an allusion to governance from first principles. So how have you thought about these first principles?
How have I thought about them? I mean, I would say it derives from the work that I have been doing at the companies that I have worked with, both portfolio companies, which I've seen sort of bootstrap as an angel investor, but also my full-time work at Flashbots and at Lido. And so I've seen these projects really think very hard about what their vision should be. And this has been really a key moment for these projects. And then from there, I've seen how the strategy derives, right? The vision is really where do you want to go? And the strategy is how do you get there? And so I mean, when I compare Maker to these other projects that I'm working with and that are really successful, then I just see a huge vacuum here. And so that is basically what makes me think that we really need to get a vision down and then put someone in place. I mean, it can be, and that's the kind of thing why I said this proposal has two parts, right? The governance supply chain is just the main concept, but you can map different governance structures to that. We could even say maker holders or delegates do the vision, they do the strategy, and they do the tactics, but at least then you can discuss them individually and you can hold people accountable, right? For example, if there's no vision in place or no strategy in place, then at least you can say we need to allocate more time here. But right now, we are not doing that at all. We're trying to make voting decisions every day without having these things. So I would say that's how I'm looking at it.
Yeah, fair enough. I'm seeing in the chat the person who
So
asked the question.
basically, it's like
strange
the
direction.
entire thread. Just a quick comment. The entire thread like kind of derives from governance from first principles, and then there's a huge document, and then like strategy, and then like basically structure. A huge portion of the document basically starts from this basically line that says this is governance from first principles. So basically, I'd like to hear the theories, like basically what is that body of knowledge that from where the first principles were gathered, and then like that kind of set, like I guess governance pipeline, like the roles, the council of makers, like how like power is structured, like what sort of like adversarial actors like does this, like I mean what sort of like have you done any threat modeling on like how adversarial actors could like take over, like what sort of checks and balances are there? Like basically first principles is a really strong word. It's just that I don't see really like any first principles being used in constructing this document. So I just wanted to like basically go back and like, let's focus on that and see like, I want to hear more about I mean, at least outline like a couple, right? Like what are those larger ideas that like, that you're betting the future of like MakerDAO on?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know what to, yeah, go ahead.
I mean, I'll chime in briefly, and this is Mark, also known as AES. And when I think about first principles, one of the biggest issues that I see in Maker today is the lack of accountability. So I think you can see, where that's reflected in our diagrams, where there's clear accountability from the core unit level all the way up to ultimately the maker holders with the council of makers kind of sitting in the middle. So today, I think there's no one doing any overarching vision, any overarching strategy. It's kind of a mess amongst all the existing participants. So I think that's a key component. And when we think of first principles, I think there needs to be accountability and incentive alignment in this type of ecosystem.
Yeah, but I see in the chat it's gone a little bit off the rails. So I think maybe we can skip the question and find someone who's asking questions in a bit more good faith.
Yeah, Chris has his hand raised. If Chris.
Hey, thank you. So I had a question about the A16Z post that also came out yesterday, and they're a huge MKR holder, as we know, who will probably end up playing a massive role in deciding what goes into this constitution. The constitution, as it was presented in those slides, it sounds like it's set up to really reduce debate and to sort of censor ideas that violate the Constitution. So that's why this is important. And so they put out this blog post yesterday titled Lightspeed Democracy. And it was the same day as this post came out with pretty much the same point of view, same topic, everything. So it could have been a huge coincidence, but it looks like there was some kind of coordination. So I'm asking this because A16Z has a history of planting ideas with DAO members and trying to get those DAO members to present those ideas as their own. They did this with Uniswap, with the DeFi Education Fund, so there's precedent for this. So I just want to ask the question, like, can you give us some detail about how the conversations with A16Z developed? Who had the idea first? Who came to who? That kind of thing.
Yeah, happy to. So, so the A16Z post was written by Professor Andy Hall. And so you may not be familiar with this because it was before you joined Maker. But a couple months ago, Maker actually commissioned, I believe, research from Professor Andy Hall because he's the leading expert on designing decentralized governance systems. So we commissioned this. He made a very long post on the forum and is basically seen as an authority in this space. And I cite him in my delegate platform as someone who I deeply admire and whose ideas I would like to implement in Maker. So first there was his post in Maker, commissioned by Maker. Then there was my delegate platform that cites him and says, I want to put these ideas into Maker. And then we have this post, which actually was completely coincidental. So I learned about it basically after the post was published. In fact, I learned about it like 30 minutes before, but it was too late to even cite it or read it. So I still haven't read it at this point, haven't gotten to it yet, but I can assure you it is a complete coincidence.
But your ideas that were in this post were run by the A16Z guys, and there was some sort of collaboration, right?
No, there was no collaboration.
Okay, so it's just based on his work that he did before.
As I say, like, as it says in the post itself, some parts of it are based on what I consider first principles, based on the work that I do with other protocols in the space and the companies that I work with, where we have come up with a vision and then design a strategy in order to reach that vision, and so on, right? So I was mapping these principles to Maker, but so Andy Holt's research is going in a very similar direction. And so I'm not surprised that there is a huge overlap between us. And I'm really looking forward to reading his article.
Can I ask one more?
Could we give time to other people, Chris, if you don't mind? Yeah, could we give time to other people, Chris?
Okay, I can ask one more quick question.
Maybe at the end if there's time.
Okay, the question is,
no, that's
this group
okay.
The group suggesting the plan, they have already put out their very clear vision for the DAO, right? A very clear point of view on how the DAO should be operating, aside from this plan. So it seems like the whole idea of this constitution is to implement that particular plan and sort of censor out other ideas. Why am I wrong? Like, is the constitution, like, debate was presented in the slides as bad, new ideas were presented as bad, this whole identity crisis thing. In my opinion, that's the nature of a DAO. The nature of a DAO is to be amorphous and to have this constant conversation going. It seems like the constitution is designed to censor new ideas and new people coming in with new ideas. Where am I wrong in that way of thinking?
I basically reject all of what you just said. Having a constitution doesn't censor new ideas. I think it's the most productive way to put all of our ideas together and have a conversation about where we even want MakerDAO to go and reach some consensus about some of these things that are lined out in the vision crisis part of the paper, right? So I think what matters way more than where we go is that we all go in the same direction. And personally, I'm completely fine if a constitution emerges from this that I don't agree with. It depends, right? If it's something that I mildly agree with, then I'm going to stick around. But if it's something that I don't agree with, then I'm more than happy to leave. And I think a lot of people think this way. I think it's way better to all run in the same direction than run in many different, very diffuse directions. And I think we can design a process that allows basically the constitution to emerge in a very fair way. And I also reject your, like you saying that, for example, A16Z has an undue influence in what goes into the constitution. I think that's completely wrong. A16Z basically owns 20% of the tokens that Rune does, and has proven for a very long time that they don't influence their delegates at all, and even put this in legal writing. So I think we are looking at very stark contrasts here.
So you don't think that whales and VC firms will decide ultimately what goes into the constitution?
No, absolutely not. Yeah, I think that maker holders are going to decide what goes into
they
the
are the maker holders. Yeah.
Are they? according to your own narrative, the VCs have convincingly failed in their takeover attempt of Maker.
No, they
haven't
didn't
even
fail.
been able
Chris,
to
Chris,
One whale,
you see-
one whale,
So,
one whale beat another whale.
I think you should decide on one narrative.
I have one narrative, and in the last vote, one whale beat other whales. So
Chris,
the
frankly,
whales.
this is not very helpful. Chris, can
going
we
to-
stop and move on to another question? Because
This was
it's not
just
very
a
helpful.
quick
Please, sorry, Chris, sorry.
dialogue. This is basically what the Constitution is going to do. It's going to censor.
Yeah.
Okay,
Okay, great.
All right.
Thanks, Chris.
thank you, Chris. We'll move it. Brett actually has his hand. Brett Lyons, you have your hand raised.
Yeah.
Thank you, Chris.
Oh, yeah, sure. So I guess my question is what you kind of envision, like qualitative versus quantitative. I mean, like a lot of companies have been successful rallying behind like defining principles. I mean, a few examples, my former employer, Ernst & Young, had a vision 2020 that was very quantitative, $50 billion of revenue by 2020. You look elsewhere, like UC Berkeley just rolled out a big 10-year program kind of codifying the more qualitative defining principles, like questioning the status quo and being a student always. Citadel, successful hedge fund, lets the most junior person make, who's most qualified, make the decision, kind of promoting growth from within. So I'm just wondering, just from like a qualitative versus quantitative, I mean, we saw the clean money proposal from Rune. That's certainly a big opportunity, but as far as just codifying it, bringing it together, what do you envision this constitution kind of looking like and signaling to the community?
Yeah, excellent question, Brad. So I think it's up to the community what goes into the constitution, but I could envision different things going in. So definitely leaning more on the qualitative side than the quantitative side. I would not put much, quantitative data in the constitution. What I put in there is what are the mandates of MakerDAO? And for example, do you want to include something like the clean money vision in there? I think that's, for example, up for discussion, because once you put it in there, then, it becomes really a mandate that we have to stick to and that we have to design our strategies against. And that, for example, the council members and the mandate actors have to be held accountable against. But it should, for example, I have quite strong feelings that it should contain like a description of the roles and their rights and responsibilities within Maker. So the different stakeholders. So what does Maker, like what can DAI holders expect to get from Maker, and what can Maker expect from DAI holders? And for example, the same for borrowers and for collateral providers but also like core unit contributors and council members and so on, right? So I think we want to really lay out what the different responsibilities and rights of these different actors are. And then finally, what we can but we don't have to put in there is fundamental questions like, is Maker a business or is it a public good? Is Maker a bank? I think this is a question that I mean, just empirically looking at the chat, but also the discussion over the last month, that's like a question that really divides the community. So for example, if we said that Maker is a bank, then a very different strategy would derive from that than if we said Maker should, for example, be isolated to the crypto space, which might make it more resilient, but also like ultimately far less scalable and maybe useful to DAI holders. But the constitution itself doesn't make any kind of moral statement about what we should pick. And so I think our proposal, I mean, I have my preferences, but I don't care what goes into the constitution, and I don't care who sits on the council. This is just a way of mapping specialized roles and responsibilities and scope and deliverables and accountability to different parts of this governance supply chain. So it's really meant as a credibly neutral proposal.
All right. Well, Thank you for that, and thank you for a great question. I think next hand we have raised is Patrick from governance.
Yeah, I actually just put my hand up for Rune because he couldn't figure out how to do it. So I'll hand off to Rune.
All right, thanks. I mean, are you guys, are you okay with that? Or do you want to wait a little bit? Because I saw those concerns about me sort of dominating it too much. And I think it's completely fine to sort of keep the community talking like this. But I do have some, I mean, I have some, basically made some like 2 slides that I think can try to sort of explain what I think is like the trade-off at the core of all this stuff. And then there's like a few other points I want to make. Yes, I'll take
I definitely want to hear it. I think as long as the conversation between just the community members is still going, maybe it makes sense to wait a little bit longer. I mean, so I see one hand, for example, from Andrew Bourbon. And as soon as the community discussion runs out, then we can follow it up. Does that sound fair to you?
Yeah, sounds great.
Thanks.
All right. So with that,
my turn?
Go ahead. Yeah, you're up.
Wow, my turn. Okay. So, you know, I've been thinking about, what is sort of the plan for minority holders? We had this thing called an ESM. We've been raising it higher and higher because it might be an attack vector. Having a harder time seeing it as such, but some people say we could short DAI on the side, not just Maker. So maybe, you know, maybe it's not a viable, like, maybe it needs to be redone, right? But like in this new first principles model that you're trying to propose here, what do you have in place of the ESM? There should, like, the ESM was designed in such a way so that like a very small share of holders can come together and sacrifice their maker without any guarantee of, basically torch a significant amount of their net worth, right? With no guarantee of ever getting it back, only if they were justified in doing so. So like, what is in your plate? Like, what is there to, like, in place of the ESM? You know, it's at $150,000, at 150,000 maker, it's already unattainable without having, I guess, you want to call it like coordination behind every single person that maybe voted like the other day, right? Just to collectively come together and just say, we're going to torch our net worth just to shut this thing down, right? So like, it's already like not, you know, it's just like, why not just sell it, right? You know, but you're doing, like, it's a big decision to even trigger something like that, right? I don't think it's, I think it's, you know, as an attack vector, it's not, I think it's much easier to do a governance attack than attack the ESM. But let's say you could attack the ESM or there's some sort of way in this new plan, like what is your plan for, you know, in place of the ESM? Something that's actually reasonably triggerable, like by like 5% of the community.
Yeah, happy to answer this. So I don't know if all of the audience is familiar. ESM is the emergency shutdown mode. So I believe this allows an amount of maker holders to burn the MKR in order to shut down the system. So I mean, this can be used against you know, any kind of sort of governance attack from the outside. But I mean, as you say, and I mean, you make a great point that this also provides a form, I mean, this poison pill mechanism also provides a form of a minority shareholder protection, right? So because a majority that knows that a minority can, you know, just burn their own stake in order to wipe out the whole system is not going to it's not going to dare abusing this minority. And as it turns out, minority shareholder protection is an incredibly important part of capitalism. And if we want DeFi and DAOs to go anywhere, then we need strong mechanisms for minority shareholder protection. I think what the simple MakerDAO proposal does is I mean, so first of all, the ESM is not going anywhere. And second of all, I think it provides even greater minority shareholder protection. Why? Because you have the Constitution that encodes principles into writing that don't exist today, and that clearly defines the roles and responsibilities of the different parties in the system. But secondly, the council can have independent parties that are not MKR holders, and that sort of provide a healthy counterbalance, right, to what the MKR holders want. And so the protocol should be run from a much more balanced point of view than just who the MKR holders want to put there.
And it's also not something that goes away, right? I mean, the focus is to keep the governance programmatic and to leave as much untouched as possible.
Yeah, like
because the only thing that really changes is the governance layer, which is related to the workforce, right? And then enshrining things that you can't really enshrine in code after that. So yeah, all of these, but it's a very good point, and it's an important one because yeah, Maker is not very, other than a few mechanisms, it's not very well set up to protect minority token holders, and it would be important to keep them in mind. So, well, yes, Chris, keep them in mind as opposed to not thinking of them at all as we do today. So there's a question from the forums around why, so we already have a delegate system. Couldn't we ask the delegates to perform this function? I think there are various questions that orient around the role of the voting delegates in this new system.
Yeah, I think, yeah, I mean, I'm a delegate, so I feel like I can speak from an informed point of view here. So the delegate role was, it's important to understand the delegate role was conceived with primarily one single goal in mind, and that was make a security depends on as much MKR as possible being staked on the current executive spell. And not only has had there been periods in Maker's history where the MKR staked on the latest spell has been lower than MKR sitting in lending markets, but often it was impossible to activate spells at all. And what sort of the Maker Foundation and sort of the governance team had to do was chase down large holders, even on Twitter, chase them down in order to activate the next the next executive spell, right? And so the current executive system has been designed primarily with one goal in mind, which is have a party that has enough MKR and enough availability to vote whenever a new spell becomes available. And that is the main thing. That is the main thing that is programmed into the incentives, and that is the main thing that happens today. Delegates today are not thinking about the vision. They are not thinking about the strategy. They are not paid to do these things. In fact, they are actively discouraged from thinking about these things because of how the incentives of the system are set up. That doesn't mean that delegates couldn't, in theory, do these things, right? That's why I keep coming back to, it's the concept of a governance supply chain, and then it's a governance structure that says we need someone thinking about each part of this chain. Some of the roles can, in theory, be totally filled by the same party, but then we should be saying, like, at least let's create accountability around this, right? Let's say maybe these two delegates should think about strategy. Maybe these two delegates should think about vision, and maybe these two should be voting on, you know, the tactical and implementation decisions. Because right now we have all of the delegates voting on all of the tactical decisions and no one thinking about vision, no one thinking about strategy. And even if they are, then they are voting in completely opposite directions most of the time, because there's no place to synthesize these different ideas and put them somewhere in a central place that can hold everyone accountable.
I see. Joshua, I think, had a question. His hand is raised.
Yeah. So I want to ask Hasu, how does he see the Council of Makers actually wielding their power, or like how do they have an effect on the system? Because the delegates still have all the voting power. So what powers does the Council of Makers actually have? Like, are they forum moderators? I mean, how do they like control the direction of the protocol?
Yeah, I mean, it's basically an informal role, as you say. So what they do is ultimately, together with the mandated actors, the council members decide what goes into the next executive spell. And then the spell is sent to the MKR holders and delegates to vote on. So that's everything they do. They have no power to execute any decisions of their own. And that's a really important part of the checks and balances and the accountability towards MKR holders.
Just repeat that, like, so the minority, what is the maximum minority power that they have to do? They could block any vote.
No. I mean, so the council can put anything on chain, and they can't block anything. So I mean, so basically, what we are saying is So on the one end, yeah, thanks for bringing this up. I think there's even another slide that might fit even better here. That sort of lays out the relationships between the different sides. So the job of the council is to make these high-level allocation decisions, sort of decide on a strategy and treasury management, balance sheet design, and DAO to DAO transactions, and so on. And together with the mandated actors, they decide what goes into, what is being worked on from a very high level. And then, so they decide basically what goes into the next executive spell. But from there, the spell is sent to the MKR holders, right? So same as today, basically, zero technical changes are required in order to enact the system. It's an informal role. So what we need is governance MIPs to put this in, right? So at the one hand, the governance, the council can, be responsible at their layer, manage the treasury. They can also hire and fire mandated actors, and that's also enacted via the MIP. But ultimately, this is all recommendations, right? So the council can, if the community no longer trusts the council and the council recommends to, for example, fire a certain mandated actor and replace them with another, and they are refusing to vote for this, then, nothing gets done, right? So, they might as well put in someone else at the council, right? So every decision still has to be ratified by the MKR holders.
I think there should be more than recommended power from a minority. There should be some sort of like hard, or at least a hard veto power or something.
Yeah, I'm just confused how this would work in practice. Like for example, the right now we have the MIPS to onboard and offboard facilitators, and anyone can propose those, and then the delegates vote on them, right? So then if the council now has that power, how does that work?
Sorry, can you repeat your question?
Yeah.
So you're saying that the council would have the power to onboard and offboard facilitators, core unit facilitators.
Mm-hmm.
So that's different than how it works now. Like right now, anyone can post a MIP, and then the delegates either approve it or disapprove it. So you're saying that now the council has that power to appoint or dismiss mandated actors. How do they actually do that? Like, do we still have this the MIP for facilitators? You're adding an in between. They don't have any maker voting power, and so how does that work? Like, can you explain that a little more? How the council would appoint or dismiss mandated actors?
I would imagine that they just issue, it can work via a MIP today, and they send the MIP to the MKR holders to vote on, right, together with the executive spec. So I think that's how I design it, but I'm open to hearing other ideas. What matters here is that the recommendation to hire or fire a mandated actor can only come from the council, or in either case, the council has to sort of agree to it before it gets sent to MKR holders. Of course, MKR holders can put anything in writing and get it passed. But at this point, I mean, it sort of goes past the council, and they might as well fire the council, right? So the council works for the MKR holders and for the mandated actors. So it doesn't work against them, right? It does a very highly specialized, very important job for them. And if they are not happy with it, they can replace the council. But in the absence, you know, if they are happy, then they just let the council do its thing. And when the council decides to hire a new MA, they ratify it. And if they decide to fire a certain MA, then they ratify that as well.
So Juan mentions you can't elect them for a year, but in reality, the idea is for the Maker token holder to hold the power all the time. So if they disagree with the decision of the council, they could recall them, for example, and then vote in a new one. So at all times, the Maker holder is making decisions about the protocol where there is no human intervention. But
yeah,
on
so
everything that's workforce.
I mean, I'm following the chat. So if you disagree, if Maker holders ever disagree with the decision of the council, they do not need to fire the council in order to prevent this decision from becoming active. They just need to not ratify this decision. And I mean, it's definitely possible to imagine that there will be decisions put forth by the council that the MKR holders don't ratify, and it doesn't get enacted. And then the council and the MKR holders have a productive discussion about it and continue working together. I was just assuming if this happens too much and the council clearly doesn't have the trust of the MKR holders, then we have to assume that the MKR holders think that the council is no longer working in their best interest, for example, because they think a different strategy could be run. And then it definitely makes more sense to replace the council, right? Because the council that doesn't produce any spells that actually go on chain and any MEPs that actually get enacted is not very useful. So
the council is basically they act in an advisory role, right? They don't actually have any real power to prevent or cause anything to happen. They just would recommend things and maybe recommend changes.
Are you an advisor to MakerDAO? No, I mean you're a mandated actor, right? I mean, so the council is the exact same thing, right? It's a role that is encoded in Maker governance, and that it has certain rights and responsibilities. Same as you, right? You don't have the power to put anything on chain, but that doesn't make you an advisor. So the exact same thing applies to the council. It's just a different role from yours.
All right, thank you. We got a hand raised from the governance house again.
Yeah, thank you. I just have a maybe not a question but comment to it. Like as you said, like ratifying the proposals. Like I like the concept. Few DAOs are using, and I think UMA is also working on that heavily. It's like the optimistic governance. Basically, everything is ratified till decided otherwise. So you have still like kind of the control in place. Like if something is not right, there is time period you can kind of roll it back. However, to not have that kind of overhead, don't need to push everyone that you need to actually vote. If it's okay, you just assume it's okay till it's not. So I think that that's something what I would appreciate maybe in that kind of concept.
Right. So for anyone watching, to get you on the same page, so optimistic governance. So right now we have basically ZK governance, which means a proposal has to reach a certain number of votes in order to go on chain. Otherwise it doesn't. Optimistic governance, on the other hand, means there's a time lock. Anyone can propose something. And then if there isn't enough veto votes within a certain time period, then the protocol goes on chain, right? So, and I think, so a bunch of protocols are now using optimistic governance. And I think it is a great addition to the governance toolbox. I think it has to be used. I think you want to use optimistic governance for basically decisions that are not that consequential for the protocol. For example, in Lido, we use optimistic governance for any decisions related to the treasury. So basically stuff that doesn't impact node operators or stakers or stake defaulters. And that's totally fine, because like these decisions are not that important. They can pass, on a faster track, basically. But in Maker, for example, if everything becomes executive space, which is where we are going with this proposal, right? Then it makes much more sense. Like I wouldn't really advise using optimistic governance for that. I think because the way that Maker is designed, the current executive spell has so much power in replacing basically any part of the protocol, that I would not use optimistic governance. But maybe, I mean, this is for the future to think about. Maybe we can, for example, strip out the surplus buffer from the rest of the Maker protocol. So for example, treasury management can be done on a different governance system than anything related, for example, to DAI or to vaults or whatever, right? So I think what you want to do is you want to look at the different parts of your protocol, and things that are very important and very critical, you want to have very high barrier to change them. Whereas things that affect very few parties and where not much can go wrong, I think you can have sort of a much more lenient way to approach them and to approve them and to move a lot faster. So that would be my thoughts on optimistic governance.
Yeah, thank you for that. And I kind of agree with you on that. Like, I think you need to first like kind of build the trust into the council, and maybe, because you are giving them some power, you want to check if they are using the powers properly. And then some of the decisions can be, fast forwarded through optimistic governance, but maybe some still should be kept, in this more rigorous process from the security perspective. So I agree with that. I just like to try to focus on the important one, and there we can have more burden, but not to have burden everywhere, because that's also kind of, security risk, that there is too many things happening and people just get lost.
There were, I think, some questions on the forums around the replication. So one of them oriented around, if the problem with the DAO is a lack of efficiency, then how does adding another layer of bureaucracy help that? Maybe it'd be helpful to touch on this point briefly, Hasu.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think of it as all as adding another layer of bureaucracy. So if we go back to the governance supply chain, then what we are seeing right now is that you have an overload in sort of the MKR role and the delegate role, and you have parts of this chain that nobody is thinking about and that are totally in flux. But you want your vision to change really, really infrequently, maybe every 5 to 10 years. And you want your strategy to change maybe every 1 to 2 years, right? So for this, like, strategies take a long time to play out, right? And you need to be able to take these long-term views on that. And so I don't think of it as adding bureaucracy in that sense, right? What it really says is we have this really like big gap right now in Makers, the stuff that nobody's thinking about. And so we just add someone to think about that. And like we make it clear that someone should think about that. And then we make it so that it doesn't change very much, right? And I also don't think about that at all as centralizing power. I mean, for example, for the last couple of years, Maker had no vision at all, right? And so it's basically waiting at all times for one person to come in and post what the vision should be for Maker. Instead, now we put some parties in charge of developing a vision or developing a strategy. And then if it goes wrong or we disagree, then we can talk about it in a constructive way. And we know like who we have to point to for that. So I feel like it adds a lot of accountability to a process that right now is, basically left completely to luck, if anything.
And maybe around this point, Joshua was asking, why can't we make a council a core unit under the current framework?
I mean, so why can't we make it a core unit? So it depends what you mean by core unit. The idea for the council is to do something else than core units, right? Which is to take a really high level view of the system that sits on top of all of the core units, that manages the budget for MakerDAO. So that already puts them at a completely different, place of basically a different place compared to these other co-units, because the council can decide the budgets for these other co-units, and they can hire and fire mandated actors, right? I think it's clearly, according to this job description, it's a very different role from a co-unit.
Great. And then how would you envision, I think there were also some questions on the forum around the process for writing this constitution. And I think there were a few proposals. Some people talked about the current delegates taking the lead. I think your proposal had some different ideas. Could you talk us through how this constitution would be enshrined to begin with?
Yeah, so I think it's still up in the air how the constitution could be designed. I think, I mean, what we know probably is it should be a two-step process, right? For one, we want there to be many competing visions for what goes into the constitution, and then in the second step, we want to have a voting process from MKR holders, and maybe if we even want to give DAO holders and borrowers and so on already a seat at that table, then that's also possible. So you want some set of parties that you choose to vote on what the best of these competing constitutions is going to be. And so I have some thoughts on the first and on the second step as well. So on the first, I mean, for one, any individual can of course go and write what the constitution should be. Maybe we should like outline that they all have about like the same structure, right? Or what should like high level go in them, right? So you can have individuals, you can have groups of individuals, you know, really sort of working together and submitting them. You can have, of course, any like that includes anyone from the co-units, mandated actors, MKR holders, the community, and so on. You don't even need to own any MKR to make a submission to this, of course. But then what we can do as well, if we want, so we can, for example, get you know, a committee or even different committees of people who we might think have, you know, have been leaders in the past in MakerDAO, right? So that might include particularly vocal members from core units and so on. Basically, anyone who has taken a leadership role in the past in MakerDAO and has the feeling that they have something important to say about what Maker's vision should be. And then we put these people together and have them, you know, work on this for a couple of weeks and then make a proposal to the community. And all of these different proposals can go in the same pot, and then we have a voting process. And how it could work, for example, I think where you can have a one-off vote, but I think what would be better is to have a multi-round vote where sort of you pitch different constitutions against each other, or you have basically like a process of elimination where people just, they don't vote what is the best constitution, but what is the one that they least want to see, right? Because this is about creating consensus and agreeing on things. And so I think removing the constitution that we all disagree with the most is going to be more effective than you know, people voting for the one that they most want to see, because the first one can optimize for basically not agreeableness, but rather sort of what we most want to see, even if it alienates others. And so I think in this process, I mean, it really comes down to what the community wants, but these are just some high level thoughts.
Got it. I think Juan has his hand up. Maybe we can skip to him. Andrew already had a question.
Yeah, thank you. I fully agree with the two-step approach, Hasu. So on the one hand, I think that writing a constitution might be a good exercise almost for anyone participating in Maker, right? Like, see what you think about the project, and then if you can get people to agree with you and rally forces behind that, even better. So I think that could be almost independent. And then the second part about the council, I asked it already, like what's the difference between the delegates? And it's like, oh, well, it's different because the mandate is different. And based on the questions that I asked, basically what I think that the main difference is that the council can fire people almost immediately or hire or reassign budgets. So basically what we're offering or what we're proposing is just reducing the weight of governance, right? We're saying the MKR delegates will now even the voters will now have zero stop freeze for any type of proposal. So there's no RFC, no freeze period. We just pass proposals at the speed we want, and then we might get punished or we might get reelected. So in that aspect, I think that they are valid proposals. For sure, you'll get much more efficiency. We usually say that governance is too slow when you need it to be fast and too fast when you need it to be slow.
I mean, correct me, sorry to interrupt you, but I mean, I'm not sure that, so do I understand you correctly that you said there would be no freezing ability for MK holders and the council can pass anything they want? Because I mean, that is the opposite of what is proposed here, right? The council only can propose spells to MK holders and governance MIPS, and the MK holders and current delegates, they have to approve everything. Nothing can go in governance, nothing can go on chain without the explicit voting of MK holders. Same as today.
But not only the council can propose changes, right?
No, I mean, only the council can propose changes.
Oh, so someone from the community comes, has the best idea in the world, and we're going to say no because you're not in the council. You need to go through the council.
No, they can post it on the forum, of course. And I mean, I would assume that the council is very actively looking. And I mean, like the way that Maker's designed, of course, in theory, anyone can put any proposal on chain and then like in the form of executive spell, and then MK holders can vote for it. But I mean, all of this governance stuff is basically a layer on top of the protocol. So a bunch of it is basically enforced because we all want to enforce it, right? You cannot put in code that only the council can. I mean, you could, but it's like, I don't think we are going to enforce that only the council can is sort of whitelisted, for example, to put executive spells on chain. I don't think we are going to want that. So I think, yeah, I mean, you ask a good question. So what is sort of the relationship between the community and the council going to be? I think it is going to be much more informal. So, I mean, great ideas and contribution are, of course, encouraged. And I mean, I would assume it happens the same as today. Yeah, but I mean, it's not really the case today that, I mean, we always say that, but what is sort of the last great proposal from like someone who didn't work for a core unit or wasn't a delegate that made it into MakerDAO? Please, I mean, if there's anyone in the audience who has an example, I don't think really there is anything. Why? Because there isn't really, I mean, for one, external parties don't have really sort of the specialization and depth of knowledge, nor do they have the interest nor the financial incentive to really contribute to a protocol as complicated as MakerDAO. But I want to make another point, and that is that the accountability of governance to token holders will go up a lot as a result of this proposal. And the reason for that is that, so you can think of governance systems as having a heartbeat, and that is the frequency with which new decisions are being made and go on chain. The way that it works right now, Maker basically has a really, really fast heartbeat. Like decisions are made all the time. There's like signal requests on the forum, there's polling every day, there's a new spell every week. Everything happens so fast. There's no time at all for the community to dig into these proposals and understand what actually goes on chain. But if you slow all of this down and you say, there's going to be, let's say, one spell every 2 weeks or every month, and it's sort of, and then you add like a couple of weeks of basically reviewing these changes, then I think you greatly improve the ability for like independent MKR holders and the community to actually review what goes on chain. Right now, in comparison, it is extremely easy to get something passed in a way that Maker holders disagree with. But then it would become way harder.
Great. Are there any, Andrew, you wanted to ask another question?
I don't, it doesn't sound like this council is that minority I was thinking of that would represent the ESM. I think it should be a similar blank box that just one day appears and has a power to do something that you were surprised to find out. There shouldn't be there could be a council that like is whatever, I don't know, doing working in this sort of, I guess, a corporate model. I mean, like if like this can get by regulators, and maybe it'll work. I don't know. Maybe let's assume no guns.
No, I mean, if you mean that, is the council like an emergency shutdown in the sense
no,
that they
like
can
there
pass?
needs to be another box. It sounds like the council like has to be actively, or you're expecting the council to be actively involved in the governance, and there should be a box for people that are not involved in, or 50, some amount of maker never involved in governance that can at any point surprise you with some kind of veto,
that's what you mean.
Kind of strong power. Yes, not someone you're like interacting with frequently or ever.
Yeah, I mean, basically you're right in the sense that it is like the reality is always like if you have sort of poison pill mechanisms and sort of the ability for any large token holder to, for example, if they get enough MKR to pass an executive spell that surprises the protocol, then yes, I mean, a perfectly accurate governance chart would display this, but I mean, this is sort of under normal conditions, right? So you wouldn't really put it in like the basic way that you described MakerDAO.
It was designed with it there though for a reason, just in case.
Yes.
Never meant to be used, but just in case, it's like.
I mean, so what this diagram shows is sort of the chain, is sort of how it's going to work under the new governance model. It only looks at the parts that are actually going to change. So the ESM, so for one, the ability for a large holder to pass pass on the fast track a hostile spell doesn't change. And also the ability for a minority holder to shut down the system via the ESM doesn't change. So these two parts are constant. This proposal doesn't touch them. And so no sort of, since it's the same in both cases and really sort of completely orthogonal to the discussion at hand, we didn't see a reason to touch on it here.
Yep. All right. I don't know if there are any other. So Andrew, Juan, I'm scrolling up the chats. Someone is asking, how would the council effectively fire a CU? Would they have the privilege to create and remove DSS best streams?
I think we actually touched on this before, right? Didn't we cover this twice already? I mean, so basically what the council would do is, I assume, create a MIP. I mean, a MIP for hiring and a MIP for firing, and then once a month it gets sent to MKR holders to ratify. So they cannot fire or hire without the explicit consent of MKR holders, same as it works today.
Yeah, run the powder, everyone can do that. But I'm going back to my original point, Hasu. I feel that it's more like change the rulers instead of the ruler. And what we have already with the delegates is a bit that, right? So if we want to change the scope, why not do that? And then it's pretty much what you're describing. I still don't see the big difference between the delegates and the council.
Okay, so to reiterate the difference again, the delegates. So currently what the delegates do is only vote sort of on stake on the next executive spell. They are voting, yes, in theory, but they are not voting from a place of vision and from a place of strategy. They are not voting strategically. They are not paid to, or in any way incentivized to think about the high level vision and the strategy. And I'm not saying that the delegates couldn't do this. Like, once again, I'm saying that there is this governance supply chain, vision, strategy, tactics, implementation. And right now, no one is thinking about the vision and the strategy. We can create another group or another change that pays delegates in order to think about these things in a structured way. And I frankly would love that to exist, right? I've been complaining. I've been complaining to GovAlpha for months that this doesn't exist, and it was part of my delegate platform to change that. because I already realized that nobody is thinking about these things in Maker, and everybody's thinking only about the low-level implementation choices and tactics. And so it doesn't matter, like, it's two different things, right? I'm saying somebody needs to think about these things. It needs to be someone who thinks about these things full time, because it's really damn hard, okay? And it is a full-time job. So anyone can do this, but we're also giving a proposal that of like one document that doesn't change, and that we all develop together in a competitive process, the constitution, to be put in place of the vision, and then we sort of ossify that. And then we add another entity, the council, to think only about the strategy and the treasury management and the highest level sort of hiring and firing decisions in the DAO. And so, yeah, I mean, if you have a counter proposal for how the delegate role can be evolved, I mean, I would love to hear it, especially and see it in writing on the forum. But my guess would be it's going to look very much like this.
And it's okay also to provide opinions and points of views, because the idea is not to, yeah, I mean, ultimately the maker holder will decide what version of governance reform will go through the chain and what version of governance reform Maker will end up looking like. So this necessarily has to be a period of constructive feedback.
My last suggestion would be to this group or anyone really, if you want to attempt at writing a constitution, I think that idea might fly much better to grab consensus, right? Because then it's like, okay, we'll see that this is a good vision for Maker. Well, not even all, right? Like at the end, the ones that need to decide are the MKR holders. So it'll be like, have a stab at drafting that constitution. Right now, it doesn't seem that this needs to be approved or anything. It's just a discussion for potentially a group. And as Seb was saying in the chat, this is just a social construct, probably a very expensive social construct. If we're going to pay, I don't know, north of $250,000 or however much you guys were thinking for each delegate, not delegate, sorry, the council member. So that's a 2 million per year social construct.
I have some thoughts about that. So for one, the alternative proposal, the Endgame proposal, also has a similar plan. I assume we're going to hear about it soon, to create an executive delegate role. So like both Rune and us, we agree on this one thing very strongly, that we need a specialized role to think about vision and strategy, especially about strategy. So that's the same in both plans. And I wouldn't be proposing this if I didn't think that it would generate like a lot more money for the DAO than it's going to cost. For one, I think we can get away with having like a smaller payroll, and so that we can be faster moving. We can innovate faster. We have more accountability. So if there's fat in the DAO, like basically, for example, contributors or co-units, for example, that we don't need, it's like everything can be is much more clear from a high level place. And this goes back to the way that, for example, budgets are approved right now. Nobody is watching the budgets from, a high level place. Every co-unit continuously proposes their budget to delegates, and delegates are not thinking about every budget in relationship to other budgets and not to budgets that might be coming up soon. They're not planning, they're not doing, a cash flow or runway analysis. They're doing none of these things. So yeah, that's why I think we need someone who does this high level.
I think Andrew Road Tortoise has his hand raised. Ask him to.
I think I just kept my hand raised. Yeah, I mean, this sounds like such a different project. I mean,
Andrew, could we kindly skip to, sorry, I meant Andrew Road Tortoise, not Andrew Bergen. Yeah, thanks.
Hey guys, sorry, I just wanted to revisit a point before and just add, I like the idea of a constitution and a vision in terms of trying to protect minority rights, because when thinking about how does someone represent the DAI holders, the whole point of having a maker token is that you're paying for the right to make decisions. So people who don't have maker tokens, they're not going to have that right. So I think the best way maybe to protect them is that you actually codifying some kind of ethical or fiduciary responsibility to DAI holders, or maybe even the crypto community at large, because, and then you can, just like in the model, show them whenever there's votes, is this a metric that you're holding someone accountable to? Because, just the whole concept, if you're going to have a voter token, is you're not going to protect the minority holders. And if we're trying to vote on a process for how we're going to vote, that's just hard to get there. So I just wanted to add that, thank you.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, I completely agree. Thanks for your contribution, Andrew. I mean, so as was pointed out in the chat, so the ESM currently need 150,000 MKR to activate it, which is $150 million. So it's not really, I mean, it used to be much more of minority shareholder protection, or rather the threat thereof, versus now we don't really have that at all. So I think a constitution that enshrines certain rights and responsibilities of different actors in the system, especially for minorities, is a big addition to Maker.
It would be a good start to start with the users of the protocol instead of spending so much time solving for the people inside the protocol, the vault users, the DAI users, and ultimately the token holders. I'm just flipping through. Andrew still has his hand raised. I think there were, there was a question around regulation. I don't know if it's even worth getting into because it's so experimental at this stage. Doesn't this increase attack vectors or attack surface?
I mean, I can talk about sort of the legal parts. I mean, so for one, this council doesn't hire or fire coordinates. It makes recommendations to MKR holders, and MKR holders make the call, same as today. Next part, so the Endgame plan also has executive delegates and would work much the same way in this particular regard. So I don't think in this regard, sort of the regulatory attack surface is any lower or higher, but I can assure you, so we have reached out to different legal experts and sort of actively sourcing legal opinions on both the Endgame plan, the viability of the Endgame plan, and about the simple MakerDAO plan. And so I would say, this is an active area of research, and we don't have the answer for either plan. And so I think it makes a lot more sense to think about this really like from the point of view of how can we create sort of minority shareholder protection, how can we create accountability and transparency and all of these things, right, that maybe don't even make it necessary to regulate us. Because if we are like honest to ourselves, then the outcome of the last vote, where basically three parties together were voting with 160,000 MKR. I mean, like if you seriously think that this is not like a regulatory sort of target on our back, then I mean, I don't know what to tell you. So I think like we shouldn't sort of delude ourselves that Maker is above the law right now, or above the regulation, in the sense that it could never happen to us. Like, and I'm very, very explicitly not saying that Maker should be regulated. I mean, I have for years been firmly in the opposite camp of that, which I think Maker's place is as a decentralized protocol that is as immutable and decentralized as possible. But if we have governance, then, and it like unfortunately we have, and it's not going to go away, then we need to make it as accountable and structured as possible.
That's great. Cool. So I'm just flicking through. I think we're reaching the end of the questions from the community. Yeah. Unless there are any other questions, I think we're, let's see, hand one up.
To end, can we just for clarity, because I'm genuinely confused, can we just confirm that this is just a proposal to please vote on the constitution and hire a council to produce MIPS? They would be paid for it, but they wouldn't have any other privilege that other people also have. Is that correct?
Yes, that's correct.
Okay, in that case, it is a very different proposal than what I understood it is, and I would have the humble suggestion of calling that out, because when you read something like the council can hire and fire mandated actors, then I would expect there to be some more like practical privilege attached to that, rather than just posting a MIP like anyone else.
So, I mean, I think I would think about this from the perspective. So what the council serves the MKR holders, is appointed by the MKR holders. The council makes recommendations to the MKR holders, what they should vote on. And I mean, in theory, someone else can make a MIP. Someone else can also put a spell on chain that's going to be voted on. But I mean, the explicit reason for the council to exist is that the MKR holders don't need to do that anymore, right? And so while it is still going to be possible, and there's like no way really to prevent that, I think that, I mean, basically the role of that particular part of governance is being outsourced to the council, and it can be called back by the MKR holders if they want to. So that's how it was meant.
But do you think, Walter, that they should have a special privilege? Walter has no view. And great. So I guess the next step would be to incorporate feedback and then ideally start brainstorming values for the constitution collectively as a sort of community. The idea would be, it would be great to find a way to merge all of the different governance reform proposals into one to move forward as a community as a whole. But I guess that there are lots of different points of view, and this is part of the reality of working in a DAO, and you know, there needs to be a chance for everybody's point of view to be heard. So yeah, I think if Rune is still on the call, I don't know if he wanted to mention or ask a question.
Yeah. Yeah, like, hey everyone. Just a second. Yeah, I mean, first I just want to say thanks for doing all the work and making this proposal. And you know, I think that, like, and I think in general, it's really great to have kind of actual sort of thoughtful engagement and construction kind of, right? And I think especially because, I mean, people are talking about these principles, but I mean, obviously the principles aren't kind of spelled out necessarily, but it still reflects, I think, a kind of principle, right? Like this is sort of digging into some sort of ground truth of DAOs that I think is really useful. Yeah, so thanks for that. And overall, I also think that, like, what I was really surprised, or in a way also expected, because of this principled approach, right, is that this proposal is actually incredibly similar to sort of the part of the endgame plan that concerns itself with the decentralized workforce, right? Like, and I'll show that in a second. There's like so much stuff that's sort of basically it's the same. It's like it's not really it's sort of the context that's different, but the stuff itself is pretty much the same basically. And I mean, and that's like, I think that reflects convergent design, right? So I think that actually shows that there is some kind of principle type of approach, right? And I just want to call out that this is definitely not like some kind of VC conspiracy or whatever. Like, I think it would be great if people, like, it would be more helpful and more useful for people to be sort of more respectful and assume good intent about this proposal. because really, I mean, based on my sort of digging behind the scenes and so on, there's like, this is not like being pushed by the VCs or something. They don't even really necessarily have a strong opinion on it or anything like that. They just, I mean, they just support, you know, interesting proposals, right? Which is definitely is, I mean, this is a lot of work, again, that's being done, right? That's for digging into stuff that's important to dig into. And I think, like, what I really like is like ossification and this thing about like the advisors, right? This thing about like, it's very good to have advisors for the voters to get recommendations from, which is actually, I mean, that's already a model we have to some extent, right? But like, I'm a big fan of that. And then the constitution as well is like something really important, right? So those are just like elements that to me are really good about this. And then I just want to talk a little bit about some, like, I mean, I think some principles that I think possibly are being missed or something that are not included in this, or that I would argue is sort of the reason for the difference between this and the Endgame plan, right? So, I mean, I think for some, so first of all, I think the plan definitely agrees with this, right? That like voters really don't, like, you can't expect anything out of voters, basically. You have to really, really, really incentivize them for them to ever do anything, right? Mostly people that do something are people that get something direct and sort of explicit and specific to themselves. That's why they will do something, right? It's very rare you will have people do something with no direct benefit, right? Then I think what I consider the most important principle, right, that I think everything should be built around is this concept that in a DAO, corruption is actually legal. Like, corruption is actually welcomed in a DAO, right? So like, if someone in a DAO does something corrupt and like embezzles funds and sets everything up to benefit themselves personally and so on, that's totally fair game, right? There's no like legal protection. There's no like legal consequence for them for doing that. It's basically like, if you embezzle anything out of a DAO, it's like you followed the rules and you like you earned that fair and square, just like anyone else earned anything or interacted with the DAO in any way, right? And I think if you don't sort of apply the logic that way, then you got some kind of legal entity, right? Because now you have some kind of fiduciary duty, you got legal agreement, you got legal obligations and so on, right? So that means like DAOs are extremely, extremely susceptible to corruption, right? Because like, not only is there no consequence, but in a sense, when there isn't, like, that's really like you're welcoming it, right? It's like a smart contract you're putting out there and you're basically saying, please come and hack me, right? You should never expect not to get hacked if you put a smart contract out there. Then there's this thing of like, you know, there's like different types of decentralization, right? So there's something called technical decentralization, which I think, you know, that's like, Maker absolutely has this, and we've always been very focused on that, right? So we don't have like multi-sigs or backdoors and that kind of stuff. And we've never had that. Even from day zero, we never ever had technical decentralization. I mean, we always had technical decentralization, right? And always took that very seriously. But then there's this other concept of political and operational decentralization. And I think actually like the first time that was ever, in a sense, the ones who actually invented that, I think, was actually the SEC. So at one point, one of the SEC guys, he went out and talked about, yeah, you can have a DAO and it can be decentralized and so on. But if there's like one guy that's sort of like telling everyone how to vote and then they vote that way, that's not actually decentralized. And then they call it puppeteering, basically. And I think that you can basically agree with that, right? You can sort of think of constructs where in practice, you know, it doesn't matter that like what the sort of the technically things look like, if everything is just sort of following a single person or a single group or something like that, right? And this really relates to basically language and communication channels. So I'll get into this thing about like language in just a second, right? But like, this is really a question of like, if there's only one place to sort of get like there's only one way to sort of get the information about what's right or what's wrong, and everything sort of reinforces that this is how it works, then, you know, that can de facto result in centralization, even if technically it's not centralized. Yeah, sorry, I just want to go, like, I just think these are like some interesting points, and then I'll get to that slide I made in a second, and it won't take much longer. So another point I want to make is that something that is decentralized cannot change in unexpected ways, right? So if you can change, like a decentralized thing can sort of make changes and improve itself in ways that have already been kind of predicted in advance. But if you make changes that weren't known, like a type of change that wasn't already known in advance, right? Then what that means is you have to introduce some kind of meta framework for that to happen, some kind of like you have to build some infrastructure around that change. And then when you do that, like however that's done, that introduces some kind of new language and communication channel. And in that context, whoever sort of has the power to make that change basically have the ability to decide if they want to move towards political and operational centralization. And if you don't have a immutable finite scope, right? So basically if you don't deliberately say this is exactly, we're doing these things and we'll never go beyond that, then that will always happen eventually, right? So over a long enough timeline, you always get these sort of unexpected changes if you don't enforce that. Which I think, and what I want to then, this is just the last point about, like, I just think that actually today Maker is pretty much, the core of Maker is pretty much already doing everything it needs to do, right? I mean, there's L2 and there's synthetic assets. And these are these sort of things that these very ambitious, big things that have been underway forever, basically. But to some extent, that's sort of, I feel like that's basically right. I mean, the things we're doing today that sort of go outside that scope, they're sort of like adding some kind of new dimension to Maker that I think in this context of like, if you want to, like, you know, if you don't define those things and come up with some kind of reason why you define those specific things, then you're basically, like, that's what's happening today in Maker, I think, right? Is that you have this sort of creeping outside some kind of logical finite scope and you're opening the door to sort of any kind of scope, right? Okay, now I just want to share these slides, right? I mean, so I think, I mean, and I would argue the big difference between, so there's so many similarities, right? But the big difference between the Council of Maker model and then the Endgame decentralized workforce model is basically, like I would say basically it's one optimizes for sort of efficiency and throughput, and then another optimizes for sort of resilience, and especially this kind of like political and like this language resilience in a sense. And I'll try, and of course I'm biased, right? So this is, so don't take that as like truth. Say, oh, okay, I'm just gonna take over the screen to share my. But I just want to try to show that point. So basically, the question is sort of what language, you know. So this is like, you know, so this is how I would try to draw it basically. And so this is like, and this, I think the basic function of the council, as I see it, right, is this sort of this translator that's sort of like, on one hand, they deal with all the complex, in the weeds, in the trenches stuff, and makes all that stuff work. And then they go and they basically translate that to the, you know, the voters basically, and the delegates and the community. And it's like, okay, you know, this is, let's put it in a simple way so you understand it. And then we can go and do a work, sort of working in the trenches, right? And then those two things can run sort of in two different ways that are each optimized for what they focus on, right? Which I think is sort of, this is naturally what, if you're really just like a lazy MPR holder, this is what you want more than anything else, right? Just want some guys making you money, and then they should send out some pumpy announcements occasionally, right? And that's kind of what you want to see, and then you just want the number to go up. And then what the endgame plan is proposing is, I mean, so it's super similar. Like, one thing I want to know though is like, Hasu mentioned these executive delegates, and then so I call them executive delegates in the plan, but like they do have kind of actually a very different role in a sense. So here I've called them pass-through delegates, because the whole point is they're actually not meant to, like, they're meant to sort of they play a kind of translation role, in that they are sort of extrapolation role of like, what do the voters want, and then they sort of follow that from these the voter committees, right? So basically, at the very end, you have this this purpose, which I think is really important. And I think probably the council model could also like adopt the same thing, and would be stronger for having that, I think, because that goes back to this thing, voters don't care. So if you can incentivize them with more than just number go up, because even that is not going to incentivize them to vote never pretty much, right? But if you can give them some kind of like greater good, something that makes it about more than just money, then that's a way to get a kind of engagement that isn't just like selfish engagement, right? And then you have the voters and the constitution. I think those are basically the same thing, because like the constitution basically assumes the voters will enforce it. And this sort of, so if the voters don't enforce the constitution, then it's completely worthless. So it's sort of equivalent to the voters and how they organize basically. And then you have the voter committees, and they actually play this kind of like a role of like one of the council roles of like making sure that there are people that focus on each of the, you know, like there's a, like that there is sort of this organized focus on, let's make sure we're doing stuff here, and you know, collateral onboarding is going as it should. We need eyes on that, and sort of a unified look at that, right? And so the same thing for everything else. And then you have sort of the delegates, they got all the voting power. And so I think I would assume that's kind of similar in both models. Then the big difference is the delegates are supposed to sort of follow what the voter committees to a greater extent, or sort of like interact with them as a kind of check on their power essentially. And then the budget allocators, they also have a, I mean, and I think what's interesting is the layering of this is very similar, right? So like the budget allocators, they have a, like they also have a role that's kind of similar to the council, right? In that they allocate budget basically, and they sort of do that sort of marginally as well. And then there's these scope maps, and that's sort of another part of what this council is doing, right? So scope maps is like, and supporting core units, right? So these are specialists that are basically hired full-time. So the voter committees, they're sort of part-time and more like volunteers in a sense, right? And then they're actually attended by supporting core units and the delegates, and then the actual voters. And then what the supporting core units do, they sort of specialize in making these recommendations. So actually, I think the supporting core units is in the end the role that is most similar to the council, but it's sort of been unbundled. So you also have the budget allocators. So they allocate the budget based on this thing called a scope map, which is this like framework for each area, basically. And the voter committees, they have this sort of, you know, actual sort of the sort of the responsible, like there's some people responsible that are looking at this. And then you have the administrative core units, and they basically like they get the budget and then they go out and do the work, they implement it. And the biggest difference is, well, so basically there is like attempt to really sort of flatten it, right? And unroll the different things and put checks and balances of all this stuff. And then there's also this thing about like deliberately the interactions in the Endgame plan are sort of all over the place, right? So they don't go through this sort of translation layer. Instead, they deliberately are designed to be sort of like, so you have the voters, they can directly interact with budget allocators and you know, so basically allocate budget power to them, and then have the budget allocators allocate out to projects out there. And DVCs, they can directly interact with administrative core units if they want to learn something about some specific, you know, like operational thing, right? And the delegates are also connected to administrative core units, but also very connected to supporting core units, and also connected to DVCs and directly to voters and budget allocators, and like so on. And everyone's connected to the scope maps as well. And so, and basically I would say that's like, it's a lot more expensive to do that, right? So you have to spend a lot more energy having these connections all over the place. And there's like more redundancy and more inefficiency essentially. There's also this, but there is also this thing about like the unified DAO toolkit, right? So like the whole thing is, the language that all of this uses is like a single software system that is the same for, you know, for like the same thing you use for sort of investor relations, right? Is also exactly the same system you use for operation and sort of JIRA and collateral onboarding, whatever steps, and all this stuff is like the same. That's the same way that the decentralized voter committees sort of, when they look at stuff, right? And they sort of look, they would use the same system, right? They'll look into exactly what's happening, and it would all be based on these scope maps. And anyway, so I just want to, the point I want to make is like the big difference between these two designs. I mean, one thing is efficiency and simplicity, but then the other is kind of like how it can break, basically, right? So that's what, so the problem is with the council model is super, like it's, I would say it's basically impossible to recover from the council going rogue, right? Because they sort of control the language in a sense, right? So they basically don't, the ability to sort of like pass, like view around them, right? And see, is it even like, you know, are the results coming out on the other end of the council? Are they, you know, does it even make sense, right? But when you have this more intertwined and sort of more fluid structure, then it's kind of like the internet where you can sort of route around the problem, right? So you have some delegates that go bad and you can just get around that, and supporting core units you can get around as well. So, and I think Wout actually mentioned this, but I think you could achieve something very similar by just having multiple councils basically, like then you already start to get something a bit similar, I think. Although like then the endgame plan goes one step further and actually like introduces this unified language, right? So I didn't draw this, but you could even have an entire row of like all the delegates, or actually not all the delegates, then you're actually fucked because they have all the votes, but all the like supporting core units or all the DBCs or all the budget allocators or something like that, right? Because the connections even go, you know, like DVCs can go directly to budget allocators or directly to supporting core units and so on. And that's a result of this unified language. Okay, so that's basically it. And I think this is like a valid, like I think this is like a real trade-off, right? Because obviously this more intertwined model is more complicated. So it's less efficient. There's basically no way around that. But on the other hand, I would say it's more resilient basically, right? And then, in my opinion is that's like, you want to optimize for resilience because of this corruption thing, that like corruption is like welcomed, absolutely, right? So another, you know, like maybe an interesting exercise could be, how could you try to, expand on the council model and just try to like build in similar features or sort of just make it more resilient basically to corruption, as I think that's also what mostly people are pointing out, right? All right, that's it. I'll just
yeah, it's an interesting comparison. Thanks a lot, Rune. I think it sounds like the two approaches are basically trying to tackle very similar issues, but then orienting them around different approaches. One more oriented around an accountability-driven approach, the other more oriented around the resilience-driven approach. I think our thinking was more sort of take the existing and try to make it as simple as possible to solve for accountability. And it sounds like the endgame plan is more around accept that accountability will sort of never be solved. So the best thing that you can do is maybe add more layers of complexity to make it more difficult to capture. Is this fair?
Yeah, I would call it, maybe you can think of it as like a chain, like multiple checks and balances, right? So like the entire chain has to fail. So you could say that it's like you add extra layers, and then even if one of the layers fail, then there's a bunch of others that sort of keep them in check. And that's that's where, and one more thing I want to add, that I think this is sort of what it was brought up earlier, this thing about like minority input, right? And so that's something I call it like marginal impact, basically. So that's like the question of like, if you're like some random MPR voter and you disagree with everyone else, do you have a way to actually like participate in governance? And I think today is basically like not really, right? So it's like you don't, like, everything is sort of like all or nothing, kind of like, and especially the way we presented up, like sort of like, in the past, the trend for like budgets was like, here's a budget increase, accept that or off borders, and you're stuck with nothing and you're totally screwed, right? So it's very much this sort of like very what do you call it, like game of chicken kind of thing, right? Where it's like all or nothing decisions. And so I think the problem is then if you have that kind of approach, then what happens is many voters want to engage then, and then if you don't engage, then you don't learn the language, and then you lose this sort of resilience, right? This ability to sort of fall back on the voters and fall back on the constitution, right? And so one of the things I think is really interesting is this concept of MKR being able to sort of emergently funnel budget to different places. So that's one of the big designs of like one of the big features, right, in the endgame plan, is that like there's this concept called budget power, which is basically you delegate, like there's this allocated budget of like 100 million, and then if you've got 10% of the active votes, then you get to actually delegate 10 million. but only to a budget allocator. So not like you can't mess around. Like there's still a check on that, which is budget allocator, which is sort of similar to some of what the council does.
Right.
And then one last feature like that is in this whole MakerDAO insurance thing of like, so today, like, I mean, so if the council, they screw up, then I think it's like you enter this sort of standoff of like, okay, well, now we have to prepare for this like nuclear showdown, right? Where we have to, like, likely they know that their best option is to make it as difficult as possible to remove them. So they're going to take this sort of nuclear approach. Well, I mean, actually, not always, but the worst case scenario would be that they think it's in their best interest to basically make it impossible to remove them. Meaning, if you try to remove one, you'll have to remove all of them, because that's sort of the game theoretic optimal stance for them to take, right? And so, I think it's a little bit similar to something like what we have happened with real world assets early on, right? Where we had this like showdown where I came out and proposed to offboard Seth and move him into strategic financeable, and that's like, and that whole thing was based on basically that me and I mean me in particular had been giving him feedback of like, look, we don't want a single structure, we want sort of multiple structures, right? So there's like some specific thing I've been like, look, this is, you know, I don't like this centralization, right? I think it's like, I mean, this sort of, like it's something I consider very dangerous, right? I call it private entanglement, blah, 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 right? It was like, and then what was missing is sort of an ability to kind of like say, we don't want that stuff to happen. The other stuff is great, but like this stuff is, you know, there's a, like, and you like something like that to not have to escalate to like a big, again, sort of this nuclear kind of showdown, right? Which is where what MakerDAOs offer is this insurance, where basically instead of saying, oh, you did something wrong, Sebastian was just trying to do his best, right? He was just trying to benefit the DAO, basically. Instead, it should be, by having this kind of insurance from like an entire DAO, right? You can say, well, the DAO provided insurance on we wouldn't have private entanglement, but now it happened, so now we're gonna penalize the DAO, and then the DAO itself can use its much tighter and much more sort of coherent feedback loop to then, you know, figure out what to do about that, right? Because they don't want to keep getting fines, basically getting penalties, but they doesn't necessarily mean you have to like remove the person or anything like that, right? It's just you want that kind of, again, like sort of marginal, you know, things. You want the ability to sort of signal and settle and kind of like have this sort of interaction and negotiation almost at a small scale as possible, and really avoid things sort of bubble up to these big all or nothing decisions.
So we actually had some thoughts around this, and so firstly I agree with you fully. The views of the small token holder are not really addressed, and part of it is as a result of Maker's token holder cap structure in some sense, which is very well weighted, and it's very difficult for small token holders to have a voice. Then there's an alternative approach to MakerDAOs that again focuses on trying to keep the core of Maker very simple without necessarily, and again, this is the distinction of the approach, right? Like the simple approach, and then you know, the resolution of accountability and improving minority token holder rights by simplifying or sticking to the core, and then the other one is to sort of increase the resilience and add the layers of complexity and the double checks and balances and so forth of the endgame plan. But one way of solving for the MakerDAO concept is something or something like this, where you have a sort of core surplus buffer, and then you build capital stacks on top to expand to the different domains that Maker wants to expand to. So you keep everything really simple, like you said. The Maker core basically does what it does, but then without having to do any new token issuances, anything, you just use sort of senior capital risk layers to expand to the domains that Maker finds interesting. And if there are community moonshot ideas that are completely wild but could still benefit from the infrastructure, they can bring their own capital. And then Maker serves as the infrastructure but doesn't take any risk unless the token holders allocate capital against it. So I think you can definitely still achieve some of the same objectives of the MakerDAO concept, just in a more pared back, simpler fashion and more oriented around the Maker core, rather than having to sort of invent mini ecosystems around each concept. I think this plays along the lines of keeping things simple from first principles and aligns with some of the approaches. But this is just one approach. I mean, ultimately, token holders might want to do MetaDAOs with 50 tokens each, but there are ways of doing this, and I think it sounds like the key distinction is, solving for different things with different philosophies in mind. Maybe this is where we'll have the most distance, but it does sound like the two proposals are quite similar in nature and are trying to solve very similar things.
Yeah, I agree. And also one thing to note is like typically historically there's been all these like alternative paths through a maker, and it's usually that they want the same thing, and the major question is like who gets to basically, I mean, this is what I was talking about, is when you're the one that make change, then you get to sort of decide what does the next stage look like, right? And then the big question is sort of who is in charge of making that big change, right? So that's sort of an interesting thing to note, right? Because this is really this is why it becomes like, I mean, that's politics, and how all politics really works.
Sure.
Which sucks actually, but in the end, we have to accept that this is just how DAOs work. They're just super political.
Yeah, to an extent. We're hoping to bracket that to once a year, but maybe even that's too naive. But I think for practical purposes and conscious of everyone's time, I think it might be useful to continue this discussion and this engagement around the ideas that are in common around the two proposals, instead of just sort of putting the proposal on the forum and let it flounder, but to sort of actively seek feedback from the community and see what ways there are in bridging these differences to make sure that there's, in a best case, sort of one governance proposal that the DAO can get behind. And then for that, I guess we'll be in touch behind the scenes. Cool.
Yeah, I'm definitely interested in that.
Thanks everyone for all your time. Thanks for the questions. Appreciate the heat in the chats. I'm glad to see so many people had so much free time. Look forward to the next steps, look forward to the community feedback, and thanks so much for your time.